China-U.S. trade talks have returned to normal after a 2-month hiatus. Will a truce be signed after the U.S. decided to suspend new tariffs, ease certain export restrictions on Huawei, and exempt 110 Chinese products from the 25% tariff imposed 1 year ago? Will the next round of trade negotiations be any more productive and lead to a full lift of the tariffs that the Chinese government insists should be eliminated completely? And what remaining questions need to be resolved for better bilateral relations overall? To discuss these issues and more, I'm very happy to be joined in the studio by Stephen Roach, Senior Fellow at the Jackson Institute of Global Affairs at Yale University, and Charles Liu, founder of How Capital. That's our topic. This is a dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Gentlemen, China and the U.S. have relaunched trade talks after a 2-month break as top trade officials from each side spoke on the phone. How optimistic are you that this round of negotiations will deliver some breakthroughs, quote unquote?
I wish I could say to you that I'm optimistic, but I'm afraid I'm not. It's good that both sides are talking, but they're talking on the basis of the same framework that failed to make a breakthrough for nearly a year. The focus is on resolving the trade issues by fixing the bilateral trade deficit between the United States and China. That does not address the problems that are afflicting American workers. It just shifts trade from China to someone else. And the structural issues, which have long been the most difficult aspect of the negotiations, technology, the technology transfer, joint ventures, the role of state-owned enterprises. There's no real sign of a breakthrough on those critical issues as well. So I'm encouraged that there's conversation, but I'm not enthusiastic about where that conversation is going.
To have a better understanding about what deliverables we're going to have for the latest round of trade talks between the two sides, Charles, let's look at what has been agreed upon between President Xi Jinping and his American counterpart on the sidelines of G20 in Osaka, Japan. Given the tough and hostile attitudes and China policy of the Trump team, and particularly the unpredictability of the presidency, are you optimistic or pessimistic about the outcome, if any, of this 12th round of trade talks?
It really depends on what you consider to be a fruitful result of the trade talks. Why? Because the sides are looking for very different things. Even within the U.S. administration, there are all kinds of different expectations or objectives. This is why you ended up having attack with a big stick, and then you have to pull back. Like the attack on Huawei is before they realize that 25% of rural America runs on Huawei equipment. What do you do with components? What do you do with after-sales service? I think in terms of expectation from the two sides, China stressed something very different from what the U.S. side stressed. China stressed equality and mutual respect. No more wielding the big stick or the big bat in trying to beat us down. The U.S. side did not stress that, talked about China will be buying a lot of agricultural products, loosening up a little bit the restrictions on Huawei, and so on. So I think the two sides are actually still talking across each other and not with each other.
Steve, last time when Vice Premier Liu He and the Chinese delegation were in the D.C. for the 11th round of talk, the Chinese government was accused by the Trump administration of backtracking on some of the details of the agreement. What do you think of the latest development? Do you think after the summit meeting on the sidelines of G20, heads of the two states agreed to flip the page and move forward in a more constructive way? Does that mean, if this is true, does it mean that China has made some concessions?
It's hard to say. I think that the meeting was relatively brief between the two presidents. I don't get the sense that China has compromised on its core principles.
Which are?
Which, as Charles said, to be treated with mutual respect, and that if concessions are made, that concessions need to be made by both nations, that this is a compromise, which means that everyone has to give up a little bit, rather than one side get everything and the other side be forced to concede. China has a system that places great emphasis on industrial policy, on the role of state-owned enterprises, and on its own sense of focusing on indigenous innovation to drive its economy through the middle-income trap area. China's not going to give up on those core principles. The United States seems to feel that China needs to rethink those objectives, and I think until both sides come to an understanding of what is negotiable and what is not, then they could be stymied.
Many Chinese observers, Charles, I wonder if you are one of them, pointed out what the United States wants through these negotiations is a kind of it's the kind of thing that is very similar to the CVID concerning the process of denuclearization in the Korean Peninsula. For example, CVID, complete or comprehensive, irretrievable, verifiable, okay? Particularly the last item, verifiable. Verifiable means Americans will send their inspection teams to make sure that the what has been agreed upon in the agreement will have to be executed precisely in the spirit of the understanding.
This is an issue of sovereignty and independence of the country. In January and February of this year, Steve Mnuchin was actually talking about we're very close, we're 90% there, and on some hard numbers, they were very close because they were talking about China buying more things, reducing the trade deficit, and so on and so forth. But then it came to monitoring, the verifiable concept. What the U.S. side apparently had wanted were inspection teams all over China. And that's an issue of sovereignty, and that's a red line. I don't think it's something that the Chinese will ever even think about giving up.
The U.S. announced a significant relaxation of the Huawei ban after the G20 summit. What signals does this move send out, and how will the partial lift of the ban affect Huawei and American tech companies?
Well, I mean, this is exactly the same script that was used to deal earlier with ZTE. Get tough, push a very important Chinese economy to the brink of a very difficult situation, and then back off. And Huawei is certainly emblematic of a very successful and powerful, forward-focused Chinese technology company. I think the recognition on the part of the U.S. officials was that a number of leading American suppliers, Broadcom, Qualcomm, Applied Materials, were all intimately involved in the Huawei supply chain, and they were objecting strenuously to the pressures that were being brought to bear on Huawei. And you know, there's this whole idea of where is America when it comes to developing its own indigenous 5G capability. So there has been pushback. There's still a strong constituency in the U.S. Congress that does not want the Trump administration to relax any pressures on Huawei. And there's this whole notion of we'll open up the supply chain for components that are not aimed at issues that are sensitive to national security. It's hard to draw that line. So the jury's out on what the Trump administration's strategy and policy really is with respect to Huawei.
Charles, do you think President Trump has obviously underestimated the political will of the Chinese leadership in sustaining the trade talks with the United States?
Well, he's being seen by everybody, not just the Chinese, but worldwide, as just a bully wielding a big stick and wants to beat people up. Now, in Huawei's case, it's also interesting. Despite Pompeo's massive efforts in getting U.S. allies to reject Huawei, Huawei is still the dominant force in 5G. Even yesterday, one of the other member of the Five Eyes, New Zealand, has come out saying that we would not preclude the possibility of using Huawei equipment. So when your closest allies, including the UK, Germany, France, Italy, and New Zealand, decides that they have to go with Huawei, they have to consider going with Huawei, it shows something's wrong in your initial strategy formulation.
Steve, earlier this month, the Washington Post published an open letter to President Trump titled, "China is not our enemy." And efforts to make China enemy will only be counterproductive. That's what the letter says. I wonder if you have signed the letter.
I was not a signer of the letter. There were a number of things in there that I very much agree with and endorse, and that is that the rise of China has been an extremely important development that has obviously benefited China, the rest of Asia, the United States, and the world economy. And to characterize China as almost an enemy of the state, which is very much the mindset now in American political circles, Republican and Democrat alike, I might add, risks making an egregious mistake. But there were a number of points in the letter that I honestly did not subscribe to that would make it uncomfortable for me to endorse. And
for example?
The allegations of forced technology transfer, which has become the poster child of the so-called Section 301 allegations leveled at China. You know, in the lengthy report that the U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer delivered to the President in March of 2018, he admits on page 19 of the report, check it out yourself, that there's no evidence of forced technology transfer between joint venture partners. And I might add that when you sign up for a joint venture, it's a willing contract between two partners, American and Chinese. You're not forced to sign that contract, and you're not taken behind closed doors in a back room, having your arm twisted, and being coerced into turning over your core technologies. So I could not endorse a letter that confirmed that that was a legitimate charge.
Thank you so much, Stephen and Charles. You are watching Dialogue on the latest round of trade talks between the United States and China and the comparison between the two economies when it comes to how to sustain their growth in the near and the foreseeable future. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Charles, what do you think of 杀敌1000自损800? When you kill 1,000 enemy troops, you're going to do that at the cost of self-inflicted casualties of up to 800 on your side. So what do you think of this Chinese proverb?
I think in China's case, the trade battles or whatever the impact of the tariffs and the attacks against Huawei and other Chinese companies has actually resulted in a bigger wound inflicted on themselves in the U.S. than in China. China has been moving its low-end manufacturing out of China themselves. It's Chinese entrepreneurs who are moving to Vietnam, to Thailand, to Indonesia themselves because of rising wage costs and other things. So but the impact on the U.S., the extra cost is actually a tax levied by the government, the tariffs. So it is being borne really by the importer, by the U.S. importer, and also by the U.S. consumers. In terms of the attack on Huawei, what it does is it actually gets the Chinese government and Huawei and much of the Chinese populace to be even more focused on the need to be able to develop your own core technology.
Stephen, many things must have happened ahead of the summit meeting at G20 in Japan. For example, the process of a 7-day congressional hearing with so many American companies complaining bitterly about the price that the United States has to pay in this trade war. Do you think, for example, Huawei issue got the attention of your president, and he starts to be very serious about the price that the U.S. got to pay if they are to sever completely the cooperation between Huawei and the suppliers from the United States?
Well, I wish I could, agree with you that the president is operating in a logical way to, appreciate the imbalance between the costs and the benefits of opting for tariffs is a solution to his, quote, China problem. But this is crass politics. This is not about economic logic. The economic analysis behind the Trump administration's anti-China trade policy is totally flawed. The United States, for example, because of our shortfall of domestic saving, we have trade deficits with 102 countries. 102. China's the biggest because of some obvious comparative cost advantages and production efficiencies that China has relative to our other trading partners. But if we don't boost our saving and we put tariffs on our largest foreign supplier, all we do is divert trade to other foreign suppliers that are higher cost producers, and that taxes American consumers. So this is not about logic. The president didn't watch the hearings.
Then the question is, Stephen, does the Trump administration have any serious and influential economists to assist with the policy-making process?
I'm still looking to meet one. No, the answer is no. Unfortunately, a number of the senior advisors were educated at the institution that I now work for, Yale University, and they obviously didn't study their economics very well, or they completely forgot it. Because we teach economics students in the second week of their undergraduate course in macroeconomics that saving must always equal investment. And if you don't save, you're going to run current account and multilateral trade balances to attract the capital. That's where China comes into the equation. And the Trump administration advisors are unable or unequipped to present that very simple, basic argument to our president.
We can even add some more. The inability to save. What about 1.5 trillion in budget deficit this year?
Exactly.
Where is the country headed? Could be disastrous.
Well, that's the point. Our saving right now is already far too low. And that's what forces us to run trade deficits. But it's going from bad to worse for exactly the reason that Charles said. We're going to be knocking down our domestic saving by at least 1 percentage point of GDP over the next 10 years because of these outsized, ill-timed, poorly designed tax cuts of late 2017. That's going to make our trade problems more acute in the future than they are today. What are we going to do then? We may, quote, solve the China problem, but we're going to have a lot of other problems that will come from other trading partners.
Let's look at the issue of saving more money. It's going to be a mission impossible, don't you think so, Charles? That it's very, very difficult to change the behavior of American consumers. They would never save money. They would enjoy shopping sprees.
Yeah, absolutely. You have 43% of the U.S. population, this is the latest poll that just came out, will not be able to face a crisis. For example, somebody gets sick suddenly. You're talking about 43% of the U.S. population because of lack of savings, living on, we call it paycheck to paycheck, sometimes even pre-paycheck borrowing. Stephen, I don't know what else they call it. you know, you get a loan.
Irresponsible.
Yes. But Chinese are famous for saving. They've been saving for centuries.
Well, but you know, there's a paradox here. China saves too much.
Yeah.
And it actually does. The U.S. saves too little. The healthy solution would be to bridge the gap a little bit and deal with budget deficits, allow Americans to save more, and continue to push Chinese saving lower, to use that saving to fund the social safety net, to provide incentives for domestic consumption in China, because the consumption share of the Chinese economy is far too low today. It needs to go up. And saving absorption, as opposed to accumulating surplus saving, is a critical piece in that equation.
Well, saving too much might have been the chronic issue of the older generation in China. Look at the behavior of the growing middle class, with the use of online payment. Look at you know, the single stay, the shopping craziness. Charles, do you think China is undergoing quiet but profound changes in terms of the behavioral pattern of Chinese consumers?
Well, there's no question. Singles Day, 11/11, is absolutely amazing. And the demand on quality of life by middle class. Even in terms of spending, they're willing to spend more for organic food now instead of just packaged food in general. All of this is beginning to happen. It's the rise of the middle class. Right now it's 300 million, maybe, plus or minus. But according to some economists' projections, in 5 years it will be 400 million. There's further urbanization taking place. And this is going to, hopefully, Stephen, accelerate the sales and the spending part of the Chinese population.
I'm impressed by one of the 3 reasons that Nobel Prize winner economist Paul Krugman said in his recent article in New York Times, that Trump is losing the trade wars for 3 points. First, 3 reasons. First, the U.S. needs to recognize countries like China have distinct cultures and identities and are unwilling to give in to humiliating terms. Second, he says, his tariffs are hurting American businesses. And third, his trade wars are largely unpopular. Now let's look at the first. China is obviously a very different national identity in terms of the culture and history. So do you think the team of the Trump administration is aware of the sea difference between the 2 cultures?
I think it transcends the Trump administration. There's a Washington view that believes strongly that when China joined the WTO in 2001, that was a critical development that would bring China into the Western mold of a market-based economic system. And there's a strong pushback coming from the Washington consensus that China is not conforming to the American value proposition. And to me, that view is really out of step with this important point you're making about the difference between 2 systems. There was no conformity of systems written into the WTO accession documents. I've read them carefully. There was no language whatsoever that suggested that. There were specific provisions regarding the role of state-owned enterprises, the tariff reductions that were required as part of the ongoing WTO conformity that was required of China. There's reason to be concerned about China's compliance with some of those areas, but in terms of appreciating the difference between 2 systems, that is really not something that is I think, deeply thought about in the United States.
If China follows the path of U.S., it becomes like India. The per capita GDP will be 1/5 of what it is today, which is the case of India. There will be complete disaster. There will be turmoil all over, and it will be disaster for neighboring countries as well. China is going through a particular phase of its history, and the whole system is based on its history. Now, as Deng Xiaoping said, black cat, white cat. Whichever cat catches the mice is the good cat. He was not implying it's this party or that party. He talked about China is doing a very difficult, undertaking a very difficult task at a particular phase of its history. So I think, you know, the battle of the civilization, we see that some people would say that democracy in the U.S. has brought about a president who doesn't seem to be very knowledgeable about the world, or about politics, or about the economy. Some would say that democracy in the Western style brought about something that's considered British suicide in terms of Brexit. So I think there are many different ways of looking at it. In the Chinese case, at least what we see, what we had over the last 4 decades, is results have been achieved. The livelihood of people in China has really risen, 600 million taken out of poverty, together with parts of Asia and even Africa, 600 million taken out of poverty. Improved livelihood all around.
That's a great point. But one of the first things they teach you on Wall Street, past performance is not a guarantee of future returns. So China's got a lot of challenges that it must face, and it should face those challenges on its terms. But whether it's transitioning to a consumer-led society, addressing environmental issues, the debt intensity of economic growth, the indigenous innovation that's required to avoid the middle-income trap, these are important and urgent challenges that are not necessarily evident on the basis of the past 4 decades of spectacular growth. So the need for China to change and rise to those challenges is absolutely critical. And China is entitled, like any nation, like any society, to do that on its terms, not on the terms dictated by others.
Looking to the future, gentlemen, very quickly from each of you, your answer, please. What will be the major force to sustain the Chinese economy? First, Charles.
Well, like Stephen said, increased consumption and the services side, an improvement in terms of innovation, in terms of technology development.
Stephen?
Yeah, I would echo all that with a big emphasis on shifting from imported to indigenous innovation, spreading out the productivity gains from manufacturing to services, and utilizing more and more of that surplus saving to fund a deeper and broader social safety net, which is absolutely urgent for Chinese families.
Thank you so much for your meaningful participation in this edition of Dialogue. Goodbye.